This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on robust GST evasion detection mechanism and increased compliance measures. The participants are Shishir Sinha, economic analyst, and Rajesh Lake, AIR correspondent.
A report by the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister has said that the performance of the GST network, the IT backbone for the indirect tax regime, has improved over the last 5 years. So what parameters were used to calculate that the GSTN is more robust now?
The most important thing is that whether the taxpayers are facing any kind of problem in compliance or not. That is the most critical thing. So when you are filing, say, form GSTR1 or GSTR3B, these two are the critical forms. And then you have the annual form of GSTR9M. So these are the forms which an assessee has to file. When you are facing any kind of difficulty in, say, monthly filing of GSTR3B, that shows that there is some problem in the GSTN. Now you are not having any problem, and the proof is that 91% of the assessee filed GSTR3B in the month of March, and 93% people filed GSTR1 in the month of March. That shows that the more and more assessors are able to file the returns, and that shows the robustness of the GSTN. And that is the most critical factor, and that is how we judge whether the system is working in a proper manner or not. And that also boosts the compliance, which in turn boosts the collection.
The figure says that at the end of December 2022, 76% of taxpayers filed their returns on time, but it has been suggested that there was a scope for further improvement as VAT or GST compliance in 44 countries was in the region of 86 compared to 76 that I mentioned. So is it the case that the system would benefit from some specific simplification in the process, or is it the case of nudge working better there?
I think the simplification is the key, and we have seen this kind of things in the income tax system. Now we all know that how the income tax forms are being filled. I mean, you don't have to write down each and every number in the form. Everything is a kind of pre-filled kind of thing. Under the GST, when the forms are simple, when the forms are pre-filled, when the filing form is not a kind of headache, and you are not just waiting for the last date to file the return, all these things are certainly going to boost the assessee confidence. So rather than going for the nudge is the last resort. The first resort is how to make simple, how to prompt the assessee to come and file the return, rather than giving a kind of warning or giving a kind of caution that if you don't file by this date, this will happen or that will happen. The assessee should be in its or her own, should file the return before the due date. That will certainly reduce the problem, and the system which is in a position to take return traffic in a large number, that is also helping assessors to go for the compliance.
You talked about compliance. So what steps has the government taken to increase this compliance, and what role has the data analytics and human intelligence done to identify such fraud?
I will just list few of the measures which government has taken, or rather I would say GST Council has advised, and accordingly government has initiated those measures. The first one is, of course, what you can say, curbing the fake invoice. That is the most important thing in the compliance, because when you are curbing the fake invoice, that means you are discouraging people for the tax evasion. So that is the most important thing. The second thing is that reducing the threshold for going for the e-invoice. Earlier it was 20 crore, now it is 10 crore. That means more and more assessors have to generate e-invoice, and that means their transaction will be recorded. The third, another important thing is that mandatory Aadhaar-based authentication for new GST registration. That means you are not a fake person, you are not a bot, you are not a kind of dummy person. You are a real businessman who are going for any kind of business, and you are in a business of supplying goods or buying goods and selling goods. So that is the another measures which have been taken. The fourth one, which is also very, very important, is that the last person who is getting the benefit, now they are being made liable if there is any problem in the person or the supplier who has not filed the return or who has not paid the tax. He will also be liable. So suppose that you are doing a transaction with somebody, and the person with whom you are are doing the transaction, he is not compliant or he is not doing the compliance, then you will also be responsible for that. So it is your responsibility also to do the business with the right persons. So these are 3-4 measures which the government has initiated based on the GST Council recommendation to improve the compliance. Now coming to the second part of your question, which you talked about, the artificial intelligence and the manual intelligence. See, artificial intelligence had its own limitation. I mean, they will work only on the data which has been put into the system. Now, the manual intelligence has much wider scope. I can give you one example of one particular shop in a tier 2 town selling snacks. So they were not paying any kind of GST, and their sales were much more than what the people were expecting, what the others were saying. So what the GST official did, they went for survey for almost 4 days, and they were just counting the dona, what we call, on which this snack is served. They were just counting that how many donas are there. Accordingly, they also noticed that how many tins of that edible oil is supplied to that particular shop. Then they went for how many cylinders are supplied to those shops. So these are something which based on the human intelligence, and finally they come to know that this particular shop is evading GST, and they issued notice and they managed to collect the GST from that particular establishment. Can you think of this kind of situation with the help of artificial intelligence? May not be. But with the help of manual intelligence, they managed to find who is evading the tax and what kind of action can be taken against that person.
And so what is GST evasion for the listeners' benefit, and also what is the modus operandi adopted by fraudsters? I can think of short payment of tax by undervaluing taxable goods and services. What are the other modus operandi?
See, the most important tool which people are using is a fake invoice. That means you are, say, a businessman who is going to buy something from one particular supplier. There is no real transaction, there is no real supply of good, but you have got a tax invoice. On the basis of tax invoice, you went to GST department and says that we have made a purchase of this thing and now I am claiming this much input tax credit. There is no transaction, there is no real good supply, but you are claiming what you call as the input tax credit, basically the tax which have been paid on the inputs. So this is one modus operandi which people are using, what we call as a fake invoice. That means the establishment or the entities, they do not exist, but you are doing a business with them. This is number one. Number two, what we call in a traditional language, kacha pakka. Kacha pakka means there is no real tax invoice issued. All the transactions are happening in cash and there is no payment of any kind of tax or there is no issuing of any kind of invoice. The third thing which many of the businesses are doing, all transactions in cash. They are not going for any kind of digital mechanism, because when you go for digital mechanism, it is easy to track that what is the volume of your business. So that is another thing which the fraudsters are, or what you can say evaders are adopting. But now with the help of artificial intelligence and the technology, and also with the help of manual intelligence, the government has managed to check these kind of activities. And also there's a tie-up between CBDT, that's the Central Board of Direct Taxes, and the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs. So they are sharing data. Like you have filed a return, so that will show that what is your earning. If your business is much more than what you are earning, which you have shown in your income tax return, that will give some kind of suspicion to the tax official that he is evading. So these are some of the methods which government has adopted to check these fraudsters.
How can one report a fake GST bill?
If you have to identify a tax invoice, the first thing you need to notice is the GST number. Every invoice must have the GST number, number one. Number two, you have to see how the tax have been mentioned. Like if you are paying, say, CGST and SGST, both should be clearly presented in the tax invoice. If you are paying IGST, that's the Integrated Goods and Services Tax, that should also be mentioned. One thing we must remember that when IGST is levied on any transaction, then there will be no CGST or no SGST. Either it will be CGST and SGST or there will be IGST. So one thing, what you have to see, whether there is a GST number or not. Number two, whether the tax have been levied and presented in the invoice in the proper manner or not. So these are the two things through which you can identify whether it is a fake bill or whether it is a real bill.
What about the non-payment of tax on supply of taxable goods and services, which is quite clandestinely removed?
See, what happens when you are getting some goods? So what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is to pay the tax on that. When you are providing any kind of services, if it is a taxable, then you have to pay the tax to the government. Now the problem is that sometimes the people who are not issuing any kind of invoice and they are providing goods and services, they are not paying any kind of tax to the government. This is something which is really a headache for the government, how to track those things, because in very smaller cities, smaller towns, it is very difficult to identify each and every individual that what kind of business volume he has. So it is more a kind of voluntary thing. It is also on the taxpayer thing that whether he is paying the tax and whether he is getting a kind of comfort and also getting all kind of benefits in the government scheme. If you have paid the tax, you will get benefits under various government schemes because you have to show your returns, that how many returns you have filed and whether you have paid the tax in a proper manner or not.
So what happens if a seller does not pay GST?
Number one, if the seller has not paid the GST, that means the purchaser will not get the input tax credit. Because the GST system is what? GST system is a chain. Anyone who is opting out of that chain or when he is taking out himself or herself from the chain, the next person will not get the input tax credit. That means his business will get affected. So it is not just the responsibility of the government but also the responsibility of the purchaser to ensure that the supplier has paid the tax so that he or she can claim that this much input tax credit I am supposed to get and final tax liability will be minus input tax credit.
How can the purchaser ensure that GST has been paid?
In the GSTN system, you have the option to see whether the person who has supplied goods to you or who has supplied services to you, whether he has paid the tax or not. That is the most important thing, because when you are putting the invoice into the system as a purchaser, you also have to mention that this particular GSTN number was the supplier to me and this particular GSTN has given the tax. If he has not given the tax, the system will also say that this particular supplier has not given the tax or has not deposited the tax. So this way you can identify that whether the person who is making supply to you is a genuine one or a fake one.
What kind of punishment is given to a person who's not filing GST?
The one is when you are not filing GST, the most important form for any tax assessee is the GSTR 3B. GSTR 3B form is something which shows that how much tax you have to pay after deducting input tax credit. So if the person has not filed the GSTR 3B, then after a month he will not be able to file another GSTR 3B. That his journey into the GST will be disturbed. He will not be able to do so. So that is one thing. Number two, when you are not paying the tax, when you are not filing the GSTR 3B, that means you are evading the tax. That means you are liable for first the penalty, and if the amount goes beyond a certain threshold, then there is also a provision of imprisonment for the person who has evaded the tax.
And is there a punishment for fake GST invoice?
Yes, that is the most important way or most what you can say prevalent tool of GST evasion, tax evasion, and that is why government tried to ensure that there should not be any kind of fake invoice. But please remember that any kind of tax system, whether we talk about the direct tax or whether we talk about the indirect tax, all the taxes are prone to evasion. There will be some person, there will be some fraudster, there will be some assessees who will always try to take benefit of some loopholes into the system and go for the tax evasion. So you cannot have 100% non-evasionary system. You will have some people who will go for that. It is up to the government to and also the tax department to find where and how they are using this kind of system or how they are misusing the kind of system and taking advantage and going for evasion. It is always said that the fraudsters or the evaders are always one step ahead of the government. So now the government has to think that how that one step can be checked.
Just want to know, you mentioned GSTR 3B. What is the maximum penalty under that?
See, the amount varies from the tax liability. The most important thing is that if you are not paying the tax, the first step will be the next month you will not be able to file GSTR 3B. That means you will not be able to take advantage of the ITC. You will not be able to take advantage of any government scheme. This is number one. Number two, a normal system is that 100% interest or what you can say penal interest is always there. So what kind of tax liability is there? There will always be at least 100% thing. And of course, when you are crossing a certain threshold, then the final thing, which is the prosecution and the imprisonment, everything is there. So government has all those things in hand, and that is why you must have noticed that in all the evasion cases, the arrest numbers are also on the rise. That shows that the fraudsters are, if they are taking one step forward, then the government is also keeping an eye on them.
Thank you, Shishir, for being with All India Radio.
Thank you very much.
You are listening to a discussion on robust GST evasion detection mechanism and increased compliance measures. The participants were Shishir Sinha, Economic Analyst, and Rajesh Lekh, AIR Correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com